So we had a discussion the other week in Swedish, though. I don't think we have that in English. Maybe it's relevant to bring it up in English anyways. We had a discussion the other week regarding Google Fonts, who was actually, according to the EU, or the Germans, I should say, breaking GDPR law by with the service of Google Fonts, where you can use that as an online service for your fonts, for your websites, and so on and so forth, right? And we got the question, why wasn't that deemed as harsh? Because it was like €100 fine. It was quite ridiculous in itself. So it was more like a slap on the fingers than anything else. And then we got the question, well, if that only got like a minor, very, very minor slap on the fingers, why is Google Analytics so much worse? And fair enough, good question. Google is Google, it's the same company. They have a service called Google Fonts and they have a service called Google Analytics, but they are vastly different in how Google uses that service. How?
Yeah, just start with so you just when you render a site, when you go and render, of course you want to be able to pick your fonts because you want your site to be looking a specific way. So when your browser, for instance, when I go to ikea.com or something like that, that site tells the browser, okay, check if you have these type of fonts cached in your memory. If not, go and get them from here. And that was what the EU was mad about, that it actually pinged that browser and initiate a connection towards Google, that's a non-EU entity. Yeah, but the thing is to remember here, even though my IP address is a personal data, it is not tracking at this moment what exact site initiated why this IP address wanted to fetch the fonts. There are 53 million options using Google Fonts, so any one of them could be the reason behind my IP address going and fetching a font. I can totally, perfectly agree that if you can match the site visited with the IP address, then it can be sensitive if the IP address is personal data. Let's take an example. Our IP address wants to visit google.com. Not very sensitive. An IP address wants to visit ikea.se, not very sensitive. An IP address wants to visit muslimgaydating.com. Now it's crazy sensitive all of a sudden.
So you can see that site doesn't exist. That's just an example of what could be deemed very sensitive.
Yes, so of course it's very sensitive. And that said, but this has nothing to do with Google Fonts. Google Fonts will always be just a relationship with your personal browser and fetching fonts. Yep. It's no tracking towards the site underneath it yet.
Well, fair enough. Good point. Yeah. As far as we know, and no, exactly.
Yeah. Google Analytics, on the other hand, now we come with the site rendering. Now we come to the part where Google actually deliberately tracks exactly what site and what IP addresses are talking to each other. Here you have a direct match. Here you know the visitors muslimgaydating.com directly, because it's part of the analytics process.
Yes, it's literally what it's built to do.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a whole nother matter of sensitivity, as we said. Google Fonts, your IP address could be requesting any one of 53 million options. Google Analytics, now it's just analyzing exactly your IP address visit this specific site and back and forth. And what did it do? What other sites did it visit after that, back and forth? This is crazy more sensitive, just to be understand a bit than Google Fonts. So that's why. Hope it gets a bit clarification on difference.
And the reason also why, because we had a bit of a rant regarding if a service like Google Fonts actually gets fined with the GDPR. In this case, they actually got fined with as a break in the GDPR the way it was stipulated. Now, what the actual fine was about, that you have the option to download all the fonts locally on your server, on your computer. So it was the mere fact that in this case, in this specific case, they used the online service rather than the downloadable version. So had they used the downloadable version, nothing would have happened, right? But our statement was more like, okay, if a service that essentially just works because you're connecting one IP address to talk to another IP address, if that can be deemed a GDPR, you can break GDPR law by have two IP addresses communicating with each other. Now we're actually starting to claim that internet is breaking GDPR. Just the way internet is structured, meaning if my mobile device or my computer should be able to talk to anything on internet, it needs to be able to have an IP address communicate via a name server to another IP address. That's how internet works. And if that can be deemed a breaking the law, guess what? Everything we do on internet is then breaking GDPR law. Now we're starting to get to a point where it's ridiculous. And this, again, coming back is to the definition of a personal data in GDPR, where IP addresses could be personal data. And I think this case was more like a slap on the wrist, also guided towards EU, that, listen here, this definition could end up being completely stupid at the end of the day. Because if we can't use internet, well, then we're going to get behind the eight ball quite dramatically in Europe. So just to have that said as well.
Yeah, because by itself, when you connect to internet, your IP address will be bouncing around everywhere. It's a global thing.
Yes.
Internet by default is global, so it will bounce around. And then you can say, but there are if you claim that the Google Fonts use say there are options, I can say any root server, any name server, there are options. You can be in Europe. But then we start to restrict everything DNS related to Europe only. And I don't think the rest of the world agrees to that. So
no.
Internet by itself is a global thing. So just visiting in it and saying, but there are options. Yeah, yes, but it's one thing when you don't start tracking it yet, when it's just your IP address bouncing around. When your IP address access internet, let's realize then it can be exposed to global pings here and there.
Exactly.
So, but yeah, of course. So it will be crazy interesting to see how far this is drawn, because I can argue that name servers on the internet should be local. I can argue that any site focused to provide something towards Europeans has to be hosted within within Europe. With this reasoning. Yeah. And that would be very interesting. So yeah,
for sure.
So that's the difference why it's why one thing is seriously an argument why it might break internet. Because just give it a reason, but you have other options. Yeah, okay. But that can be drawn to extreme. And now people think you're splitting hairs. Yeah, but this is the problem with the law.
Yes.
When you get down to nitty-gritty hair splittery, if it's legal or not.
Yes.
That's a big, big thing.
It is.
That's not very clear. So
no.
I'm just saying.
Again. But it is an interesting case, though. So we'll see what happens with that. Yeah. But I assume we have a reason to come back to this in the future.
Yes. But I hope we have been made a bit clear why Google Analytics and Google Fonts is a different thing here.
Yeah, and why we see it very different, and why EU sees it very different, in why it's an issue in one case, and why it's a much less issue in another case.